Hi everyone, my name is Abdullah. I'm the co-founder of Silverline Community and Consultancy, and I will be your host for the Mean Who podcast, a show that will shed light on the movers, shakers, and shapers of the cultural and creative industries. We kick off our podcast series with none other than the trailblazer and the tour de force, Gail Lord. Not only is she the co-founder of the world's foremost museum, galleries, and cultural planning firm, but she's also pushing the boundaries in the fields of sustainability, diversity, and inclusivity. Gail, thank you so much for joining us today. How are you doing?
I'm great, and Abdullah, it's a real honor to be on this podcast with you, especially. We've known each other for quite a few years, so it's great. Thank you.
Yes, we have. Thank you so much. Gail, let's kick off with introducing our listeners to a little bit of your background.
Okay, well, thanks for that. It's always hard to describe a background. Really, my background, went to university, but studied history because it's going to sound rather silly, but in those days, it's a long time ago, art history was considered to be a program where women went to university to find a husband, which was kind of ridiculous because men didn't study art history in those days. They were in medicine or economics or something like that. But I was very fortunate to have a terrific education. I also, at our local university, the University of Toronto, and I also, really, it's a lifelong love of the arts, having gone to galleries and museums really as a child, growing up in a way in a marginal city, which is what Toronto was at that time, but having a lot of opportunities to see art, to meet artists. And I always advise people, if they're interested in this sector, you have to start early. It is so complex. So I just want to encourage people, start early, because the knowledge that you need is so huge. It's a lifetime.
Absolutely. But how did you become like one of the beacons of cultural consultancies?
Okay. So Beacon is this kind of a hard reputation to live up to. Both my late husband, Barry Lord, and who founded the firm with me, of course, or I with him. Again, for both of us, it was a lifetime in the arts. So whereas his background was curatorial, mine was in arts journalism. I started as art critic for a very large newspaper, 1 million circulation, which was again very large circulation at that time. And my mission, if I try and think about why did I want to do that, was to make art accessible to people. For me, it's all about the dialogue between art and people, culture and people. That's what's interesting, because that's where new ideas eventually come from. And so I think that this idea that art and culture are for people is really the foundation of this business that Barry and I established together. Hard to imagine 1981, but back in 1981, a very interesting time for lots of other reasons, the arts were still seen as elitist preoccupations. Hard to believe, but still true. And so I think that very much our mission, why did we want to do this? And it's remained the mission of the company, and the vision of the company is that culture is for people. And that's very, very important. And I would say that I was thrilled when last year we had a meeting on Zoom, of course, because we're still in the pandemic. And we had the idea that we needed to develop a new vision statement. Our previous vision statement was cultural capital. We were about cultural capital. And actually that reflects the world that we're going to talk about, the world of the 1980s, the world of the 1990s, which were enormous period of building physical museums. So we got the idea, well, it's not just about physical capital, it's also about cultural capital. But we felt that in the world that we're moving into now, that's really kind of an old-fashioned idea in a way, because it's really not what museums are about going into the future. So the team, we did a process such as consultants do. I think we have good processes. Developed the vision, which is making the world a better place through culture. I think that really explains who we always were, who I always was. And it's magic to me that this vision statement came out of our entire staff working together in the middle of a pandemic. So maybe that gives you an idea.
I honestly, I couldn't agree more with you, because that's one of the main reasons why we started Silverline, is we believe that at the end of the day, when the pandemic started, what is it that everyone was doing when they were stuck at home? They were either reading something, watching something. Even you had the Google project that exploded in proportions when it comes to virtual museum visits, because we wanted to entertain people and make them feel better about life using culture. And I think maybe I'm speaking on your behalf when I say that this is probably one of the reasons that keeps drawing you into this field, is to make people's lives better.
Yeah, it's it's that. Although I've had my moments of thinking that maybe you'd be making people's lives better by being an agronomist or a scientist or working in the medical science field. Each one of us has our own destiny in a way, and those were not mine. Those were not theirs. But I don't think we have too many illusions that there are better ways to make people's lives better than necessarily having a cultural consultancy. I think that people's lives become better when they see themselves in a way on a pedestal. That was something, and that's an interesting topic we could get into, because we're of course in the era of toppling statues, which is, I think, pretty important. But when they see their own cultural values reflected and augmented and made more meaningful, and I think that it's mainly that way that we can help people. But museums become more diverse, museums become more inclusive, museums become decolonized. These are very, very important things in our time.
And of course, it's such a massive influence, but it's encapsulated in the word soft power. So what is soft power to you?
Okay, yeah, I think it's true that it is encapsulated in the word soft power. So soft power is a term that was, if you like, invented by Professor Nye at Harvard University in 1992. So it's not really a new idea. However, his field is political science, and particularly the relationships of nations and countries and states. And so it really relates very much to a field that's pretty old, actually, cultural diplomacy. And of course, our museums are indeed often filled with the objects that were exchanged between royal families and between governments, as often as a way of making peace and not war. So I think the desirable future for most people is a life lived in peace. And of course, it's always something somewhat elusive and difficult to achieve. So soft power it really speaks about how to create influence through cultural exchange and human understanding on a massive scale, not just between diplomats and gifts for elites. So I think that where soft power comes into its own in our time for museums is actually in their location in cities. Because what's interesting about cities is that starting in 2008, I think this is very relevant for the UAE, because the UAE can be seen as a highly urban environment as it's evolving in our time, is that cities don't have powers, the same power that countries have, except of course for city-states, which perhaps you're in one of them. So that's interesting. Singapore, of course, is another one. And historically, there have been others, like Venice was a very important city-state and so on. But typically, the power, the hard power, the power to create borders or to transgress borders, the power to tax, the power to have embargoes. This really belongs, the hard power world belongs to countries. And so it's very much in the new power of cities, which in 2008, this is an amazing time, which is the first time in human history that more than 50% of the world's population lives in cities. I mean, that's huge. Cities were only invented 10,000 years ago. So I mean, that's a huge change for human beings who have been on Earth for several millions of years in one form or another. So this phenomenon of the growth of cities, the economic importance of cities are responsible for 80% of GDP. Their only power is soft power. They don't have hard power. most museums are actually located in cities. And so the whole idea of the relationship between soft power, museums, and cities comes out of an historical fact.
But how does that transform the cities and communities? So specifically, let's say if you want to take any of the Gulf cities into perspective, say Dubai or Abu Dhabi, how is that, in your opinion, transforming what the city and community is?
Right. Well, I think that both Dubai and Abu Dhabi are doing tremendous jobs at this. So maybe I'll point out that in Abu Dhabi, of course, I'm a very big fan of the Louvre in Abu Dhabi. I think it's a most marvelous institution. We were involved in the very, very early days of the site planning for it, but the actual creation of it, it's one of the most advanced museums in the world. Apart from the architecture, which is of course magical, in terms of its interpretation, how it presents history. It's not the old hegemonic way of saying there's this civilization and one is better than the other. I mean, that's a problem with museums of the colonial era. I think that the Louvre in Abu Dhabi is actually the first decolonizing. Ironically, there are many people, probably a lot of people will disagree with me, and that's good. We'll have a debate. It is one of the first kind of decolonizing museums in terms of its way of interpreting the past, where it puts the past and the present and different civilizations really on an equal footing and says, let's take another look. So I think that the Louvre Abu Dhabi is very, very important. So too is the initiative of the current initiative, which is the Abrahamic Family House, which we're very involved in as well, which really is really a tremendous achievement for the region, the entire region, because it says, let's look at the Abrahamic religions, of course, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, and have a space where people can explore them all and where they can all be equally valued and where we can look at their roots, their similarities and their differences. We've been involved in developing the content for the Abrahamic Family House Interpretive Visitor Center. So that's a tremendous honor. Of course, in Dubai, it's again so energetic in its approach to museums. We've been very privileged to work on the Etihad Museum, which I like very, very much. We developed the content for it because it really signals the end of colonialism in the era. That's very important. I think it's somewhat underappreciated, but museums take their time to be appreciated. They don't, it's not an instant, awareness of the importance of something. And I would say the emerging museum of the future is also important because to brand the idea, I haven't seen it, but I've met some of the people, to brand the idea that museums can be about the future is actually quite important in your region. I think there's probably a certain thinking that museums are only about the past. But so even to make the point to the building, to the people who walk by the building, whether they go in it or not, that museums are actually about the future. See, they are actually about the future. That's a true statement. That's a big impact. So I think that those are maybe 1, 2, 3, 4 examples of museum soft power in your immediate region where museums are relatively new.
What I get from what you said, which I think I even experienced on a first-hand basis, having been born and raised in the UAE, in Abu Dhabi, have lived in Sharjah and Dubai as well, is that their approach to museums and how it's transforming the cities, and specifically with the curation of, say, the Louvre, it's more of a let's have a dialogue of differences and similarities. And this is exactly what struck me when I first entered the Louvre, is that correlation they were doing with different cultures and civilizations of a similar statue, let's say a statue of a woman in the Inca versus in the Indian subcontinent, for example. And I believe this is how we live on a day-to-day basis, or used to live in the UAE on a day-to-day basis, and they continue to live so. And perhaps maybe one of the driving quotes they still use to this day is what Sheikh Zayed said, is he who doesn't have a past doesn't have a present and a future. And that couldn't have been truer for the UAE with how they are approaching the museums strategy. So you mentioned the Museum of the Future in Dubai, but also there is the Shindera district that is completely historic. But within the district already, you could see the story of the creek and how Dubai was a major pearling metropolis way before oil was discovered, etc., etc. So there's always how we see soft power transforming cities and communities is its encouragement of this inter and intra dialogue that happens.
I love that you mentioned Shindiga because I do know it. And actually, our book on soft power starts with my co-author, Nairi Blackenberg, walking through it and her thoughts. I love that we also worked on Shindiga as well.
Yes.
I think that what's great about the project, the way it's working, is it is a dialogue between the past and the present and the future, because you can't walk there without seeing the big tower, without seeing change around you. And I think it's this dialogue between the past and the present and looking into the future that's very important. I want to come back to the Louvre, if I can, for a moment.
Of course.
You know, what was accomplished in the Louvre Abu Dhabi has not yet been accomplished at the Louvre in Paris, nor has it been accomplished in the British Museum. Oh, not at all. I mean, they are still, both of them, very much stuck in this hegemonic presentation of cultures. You know, there are the root cultures and the higher civilizations and the lower civilizations. And this kind of, well, naturally, the collections come from colonization, and they're great places with great collections. But coming to terms with how to change that in a huge organization is very, very difficult, very time consuming, and well, really very difficult and costly to do. So what I think is quite fantastic about the Louvre in Abu Dhabi is because it's on a much smaller scale, because the team who created it was a collaborative team between UAE professionals and who have a perspective, and the professionals from the Louvre, if they could do this. So again, understanding that what can be done in a decolonizing world is going to eventually have an enormous impact on if you like, these former colonies themselves, colonial powers themselves.
Absolutely. Speaking of the Louvre, though, I think that there is some kind of a point and criticism where many people said that we've approached the end of the Bilbao effect. Let's say specifically when it comes to the example of Abu Dhabi, it's like, why have another Louvre and another Guggenheim, etc., etc. So what is your perspective on this? And do you think that we've reached the point beyond return of the Bilbao effect? And is there a new Bilbao effect in the horizon?
Right. Well, this is such a great question, Abdallah. Please, thank you very much for it. So I guess the first thing I want to say is each museum comes out of its own historical context and time. And so overgeneralizing can really lead us not to have too much understanding. So if I want to think about where does the Bilbao effect in our time, I mean, without going back into ancient history, like we could go back to the pyramids if we want to talk about the Bilbao effect. But let's talk about buildings, broadly speaking, in our time. Starts, I think, in, of course, with the Sydney Opera House, which becomes this monument. What in that date, for people who are interested in dates, I'm always interested in dates, although I never remember them, is 1973. So 1973 is when the Sydney Opera House opens. And I mean, whoever heard of Sydney? This is, I'm a Canadian, right? So from the same British colonial past as the people in Australia. So that really obviously marked the city. It was a tremendous achievement. I think it's been celebrated a lot. It was an engineering achievement, and it didn't really have an immediate effect, except I'd like to then just mention the Sancho Pompidou in Paris, which is, again, really an interesting date, which is 1977. So the Sancho Pompidou, why is it so important? Well, it's important because really it's the first time, again, in our contemporary period, we can go back much further to find other examples, where it's an integrated place that brings together art, library, music, so many art forms, and an enormous public space, indoors and outdoors. It's also a symbol of transparency and very much a reaction to the reality of all the uprisings of the 1960s. People in your audience probably don't remember that, but if you think there have been uprisings recently, trust me, there were uprisings in the 1960s, and it was really an answer to a huge societal change that was needed in that country. So 20 years later, we get the Bilbao effect, and that's 1997 is when the Bilbao Guggenheim opens. And I think that, again, we have to see it in its actual context, the historical moment. What is that historical moment? And which leads to so many other buildings. It's basically deindustrialization of major cities. People think, Bilbao was the financial center of Spain. Right? It also suffered terribly in World War II for reasons I won't go into. So it was very much a reconstruction and a reimagining, a brilliant reimagining of the future of a once great industrial city as a city that would become an idea place, a place of ideas, a place of human aspiration. So is that effect to be criticized? I hardly think so. When you look at it, by the way, have to say it has been a client of ours for many years in strategic planning. We weren't involved in the planning of that marvelous museum. I wish we were, but such is history. So I think that so if you look at these big effects, wherever they may be, including the Louvre, right, in Abu Dhabi, each one is so historically determined that I think if people make a mistake of thinking, oh, it's simply an effect. It's a cause and an effect and an impact. It's so much more. So I have to breathe, and then I'll answer your question. Okay. So to say, certainly what we're seeing, especially because of the impact of COVID, is that we are seeing a fundamental shift from thinking about the outside of buildings to thinking the structure of the building as a great attraction, to seeing the outdoors as the great attraction. I think the pandemic has certainly taught us that outside is as important as inside. And by this, I'm not meaning simply appearance or architecture, as it were. And so I think that there is, in a way, a shift away from these monumental architectural achievements, this idea that then took shape that people will visit because of the beauty of the building, to the fact that we need social distancing, people want to be outside, there's the healing power of nature. So I think that there is a shift.
So time and external factors have an influence on how cultural institutions allow us to create and consume culture.
Totally. You said it so well and so much faster than me. That's great. Yes.
It was actually just it was going to be my second question, but I think you answered it in your beautiful elaboration. But how do you think cultural institutions in this regard will adapt to the new hybrid of the metaverse and reality, if we're speaking about time and context now?
Okay, so it's another long question. It's a really fascinating question with a bit of an involved answer. Museums, contrary to, I guess, popular belief, have always been early adapters of technology. Okay, so it's really important. Why do I love museums? Because they're so interesting. If they weren't interesting, how could a person of above average intelligence love them so much? So even early technology like adaptation of gas lighting, adaptation of electric lighting, adaptation of even the digital technologies. Back, you're probably familiar with the fantastic painting by Géricault, The Raft of the Medusa. It was a very major painting. Well, they took that painting, they made a huge copy of it. This is almost 200 years ago. Shone light at it, and then there must have been lamp lights at that time. But somebody will write in to correct us, I hope, or look it up on Wikipedia. And tens of thousands of people went into a black room to see what would be almost like the first CinemaScope film. So this idea that human beings and museums kind of we create metaverses, we create environments. You could even go back to the caves of Lascaux, and when you see the drawings, if you're fortunate enough to go, and I urge people to go if they can, some of them are closed, but you know that what was happening was people who sat around a fire, and these pictures on the walls could dance and move. And so the idea of creating alternate worlds, I think, is very, very fundamental to humans and our imagination, our imaginative faculty. And in a way, I think that museums are a metaverse, except that it's a metaverse and not, read about it in the paper like everybody else does, where our imagination is the main linking factor. And I guess my concern about what I've read about this metaverse idea is simply that advertising may replace the imagination. But I think that that's, again, a long-standing problem of human beings. And I think that museums are a long-standing solution.
Well, speaking of solutions, there's a very vital point that not many people know about museums and cultural institutions, which is intellectual property rights. And why it's important is because it's related to the cultural assets, such as collections, staff expertise, and locations and facilities. And they're important to museums in order to ensure that they can provide public access to their collections. But what would you say are the challenges faced by the museums when managing their intellectual properties?
Okay, I think that the biggest single challenge is transparency. Okay, so what museums have done for various reasons is they mainly because, well, I'm not too sure what the reasons are. There are many reasons. Number one is probably security. For whatever we may say about the cost of some of these huge buildings, the fact is that one room at the Louvre has more financial value in it, including in Abu Dhabi, than possibly the cost of the entire building. I mean, this is simply a fact. It's not true of small community museums. On the other hand, they have other very precious things about them as well. But we have a tradition in museums of not being transparent, and this is not being transparent about the origin of the objects, not being transparent about the information about the objects and the interpretation. And I think that that's been a huge weakness of museums, and it's sort of separated museums from the public. So we're in an era where people are demanding more transparency, and museums as institutions in the public interest, and by and large institutions that are to some degree or other funded publicly, either directly by government money or indirectly through philanthropy, which is often, not always, but often supported by government. Being transparent, I think, is a more important aspect for the museum now than it is for the creative sector. So, for example, an artist probably has more need of the services that you're talking about than a museum as an institution. I would put it that way.
So you would say that with blockchain being a technology that champions transparency, it could be a solution for these artists in order to, let's say, track provenance, etc., etc.
Well, most artists, of course, can't afford all the record keeping involved. It's very interesting. Right now, when you walk into a private gallery, there's always, like, especially a big one, there's 3 or 4 people sitting at a big desk and they're doing something. What are they doing? Well, of course, and there's always a bunch of binders and books behind them and stuff like that. They're very involved in recording, tracking, and doing these things. And I'm sorry, I'm not an expert on blockchain. You are, so we'll let you explain it. So for the artist, I think it is extremely important. Artist economic rights is a very big issue. There are methods in current technology whereby artists could be benefiting more from their work. For example, an artist sells something for $3,000 and 20 years later it's worth $3 million, but the artist in most jurisdictions doesn't benefit from that. In some jurisdictions, there is a benefit that the artist can have. It's very, very tiny. Relative to the increase in value. So I think that the question of artist rights is a big, big question for the future. And I think that there are many solutions, including how artists organize themselves. So I feel that I feel that this is a very fertile field for exploration.
And as I've understood from you, is that we've always, as cultural institutions, we've always embraced technology. So there could be a place for technology in order to bridge that kind of gap. But speaking of the future, Gail, I've known you for several years now. I've met you a few times. And I have to say, and I have to do this while I'm touching wood, you've always had a spark of curiosity and optimism about you. What makes you optimistic about the future?
Oh my gosh. Well, first of all, I don't even know how to answer that question. Let me say, I think to some degree, we're born optimists if we're lucky. So I think that that's maybe part of it. We're made optimists or confirmed in our optimism by our life experience. I guess in my life experience in the world of museums and the world of the arts generally, because before museums, I was very involved with art and artists, as I've seen incredible change and positive change. I mean, the idea of decolonizing, I'm from a neo-colony, Canada. You know, we're never the center of the world. We were colonized first by the French and then by the British, then in an economic way by Americans. And of course, we ourselves colonized our indigenous people. So in my lifetime, I have seen the idea of decolonization, which I had back in the 1970s and even wrote about back then, become a mainstream idea. We need to tackle this in our institutions. I've seen the idea that museums are for people universally take root. Museums weren't for people in the 1960s or 70s. That's why the Pompidou Center had to happen. They were for experts. They were for the wealthy. I've also seen that the making of meaning, which ultimately is what artists themselves do, why artists enrich our lives so much, they transform material reality into ideas, to meaning, to feeling, to emotion. I've seen the role of the artist be so much more valued than it was. So I guess my optimism has been repaid. What can I tell you?
I think it's wonderful. Honestly, every time I speak to you about this topic specifically, you bring a smile to my face. So I'm grateful for that. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to know you.
I would like to end with what is the one misconception that you always hear about museums and culture that you would like to correct?
Right. I think the big misconception, about museums is that they're about the past. You know, they have an image of being, well, it's about the past. I don't need to know more about the past. In my family, we tell stories about the past. And so that's really enough for me. But the reality is that museums, it's like the conversation about Shindiga, they're not about the past. They're actually about the present, and possibly about the future. Because museums are created in our time. And so a good museum is going to have curatorial staff, including young people, people of color, diverse people. By the way, I've started a foundation in my own country to encourage institutions to hire more people of color in leadership positions, because that's the key. They need to be in leadership positions in institutions.
What name of the organization? Remind me.
Oh, it's called the BIPOC Fellowship.
Yes,
I think people can find it online.
BIPOC.
Yeah, in capitals, and then fellowship in lowercase, and you just .ca. So I think that the misconception is that this is like a community attic, but no, it's not. It's a place where ideas about culture are developed, evolved, and expressed. Now, the museum may have bad ideas, stupid ideas, old-fashioned ideas, or it may have fantastic ideas, but it's always changing. So I think we have to get the idea across of always changing.
Absolutely. Gail, honestly, I can't thank you enough for the valuable contribution you've had for our community. And if you would like to follow Gail, she's incredibly active on LinkedIn and Twitter. I don't mean to pry, but your content is amazing. And I like how you always keep cheering your colleagues and your fellow members, not only within the Lord community, but in the cultural institution community. It's very commendable. So Follow Gail on LinkedIn and Twitter, as well as the Lord accounts. We'll mention these when we post the episode. And if you have any questions and recommendations and feedback, please contact us on our channels. Gail, thank you so much. I wish you a wonderful day.
Thank you. What a great way to start the day, talking to you. Thanks so much.
Likewise. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.